All right, guys. New unit, Unit 4. We're entering into the period kind of and after Columbus, the 1400s. So it starts with chapter 15. So if you look at the map, you'll notice that we start to see kind of modern nations emerging, right? Like France and Spain and England. Um, Hungary. There's a new empire. The old Byzantine Empire is going to become the Ottoman Empire. And then you still have this early kind of empire, the Holy Roman Empire. If we go back to the Franks, right? The Holy Roman Empire kind of took over for the Frankish Empire. So even in that empire, you're going to see Germany kind of emerging, and a country called Prussia that later becomes Germany. Italy is kind of a series. It's not a singular nation. It's more of a region of nation states. The Holy Roman Empire is kind of guided by Rome, but there's an emperor who runs that empire. So kind of be familiar with what's happening, all right, and your maps, things like that. So it's during this time that we see change, right? So that's the theme. If we go back to the last unit, we still Europe is splintered, right? Even though you have some kingdoms emerging, England, for example, is a nation that is kind of fragmented. Feudalism is the system of not only the economic system but the governing system. Monarchs are emerging, but they're not super powerful. Local lords and landowners still reign supreme, right? So what happens around 1400? We start to see state building, right? We start to see England, for example, become more united and unified under a singular or under a monarch. Same thing in France and Portugal, and that's basically the centralizing of government, right? So by 14 or 1500, Europe is becoming a continent of centralized states. Independent states, competitive states, right? They're going to compete going forward for colonies and wealth. They're going to enter into war against one another. And so what does that mean to be centralized? Well, like we've seen in China or in other places, right? They begin to tax their citizens more efficiently. You start to see bureaucracies emerge with top, but he has, obviously a bureaucracy underneath him. And you're going to start to see large standing armies, paid soldiers. That's what those taxes are going to go towards. So that's the change that we're seeing, and that's probably what you'd start to see is the political changes in Europe by 14 or 1500 compared to the political structures prior to that, right? So it's a decentralized state under feudalism to more of a centralized state where feudalism is pretty much dying out. All right, so we do want to go back a little bit to the Renaissance. That was in the last unit, but it also is part of this unit as well, so there's a continuum. Remember, that's this cultural awakening in Western Europe. It begins in Italy and spreads to England and France and other parts of Europe. The term Renaissance means rebirth, and it is a rebirth of kind of like Greek and Roman traditions and ideas. It's also a transition from the Dark Ages to the kind of the later Middle Ages, right? So remember, the Middle Ages was divided into kind of periods, the early and late. During the late Middle Ages, you're going to see more innovation, more cultural advances, and the Renaissance is part of that. All right, so you should be on, why does it begin in Italy? Very simple. Italy kind of did avoid some of those economic crises, peasant rebellions. They were affected by the plague, but maybe not as much so. They weren't as affected by the Little Ice Age, so their populations still were probably a little bit more maintained. Their urban areas were probably not as devastated as England and France and parts of Germany. The two major cities are Venice and Florence, and they were centers of trade. So, remember, Muslim scholars are going to kind of translate Greek and Roman works into Arabic, and those works are going to kind of make their way to Italy, right, where they're going to be then translated into, say, the vernacular. So just Venice and Florence were basically easy destinations for ideas and anything to spread to, right? Whether it's the astrolabe or the compass or Chinese paper. These ideas are going to hit Italy first, or these goods are going to hit Italy first. Also, Italy is the home of Rome, so it's going to be easy to access those traditions and ideas. Also, Italy is close to the Byzantine Empire, and they too preserve some of those Greek traditions. So again, you're going to see kind of those ideas, those old ideas that had spread outside of Europe, and now they're coming back, right? Also, wealth, patronage, very important concept. Italy was the home of a lot of wealth, ruling families, wealthy bankers, and they're going to pay artists like Da Vinci to paint. And they're going to help encourage art and learning. So you need a little money to paint, and Da Vinci got that from a lot of these wealthy bankers. All right, humanism, very important concept. It's simple. It's during this time where people, artists, writers, even politicians are going to focus more on secular themes. So paintings might, rely less on religious themes. You're still going to see like the Last Supper is Da Vinci's painting about the Last Supper of Jesus. That's a religious theme. But then you're going to see painters that just paint pictures of like basically peasants living in a German community. And that's important. So humanism is actually the study of the humanities, right? So people are going to rededicate themselves to philosophy and literature and history and geography. Again, they're going to write about, and they're going to focus on non-religious themes. They're going to think about the world around them and be less, not less religious, but maybe less maybe less focused on the afterlife and more focused on the world in front of them. And this is important. So the Renaissance is going to give rise to other things down the road, like the Enlightenment or the scientific revolution. And that's the importance of the Renaissance. It's what it leads to down the road. All right, so one of those events or trends that the Renaissance influenced was the Protestant Reformation, a very important event. It's a very simple historical period or trend. So let's go through it real quick. So before we have this religious, turning point, you have to understand what's happening is throughout those middle periods in Europe, there was a lot of corruption in the Catholic Church, a lot of bureaucracy. In a sense, the priests and the Pope, they became kind of, a little bit too materialistic and a little too corrupt. And there were people in the church that were critical of these behaviors. John Wycliffe was a Catholic. I don't know if he was a priest, but he started to talk about how, hey, if you want to get to heaven, you don't have to necessarily do or listen to what the priest thinks. You can just kind of, believe on your own and study the Bible and kind of, not be so reliant on the church for, again, salvation. He also translated the Bible into local languages. So now people didn't have to depend on the priest to interpret the Bible. They could do it themselves. So Wycliffe was kind of a very early important figure. And his ideas are going to really influence this guy, Martin Luther. And there was just this idea that, hey, how powerful is the priest, or how close is he to God when, hey, I look around and there's a plague and there's famine from the little ice age. So people start to lose a little faith in the church. Not to mention, new rulers in Europe started to kind of take advantage of the Catholic Church and started to seize church lands. Maybe they were not as afraid of the punishments that might be handed down by the church. All right, so what is Lutheranism? The Protestant Reformation is very simple. It's basically the emergence of a new Christian religion, right? Protestantism. We also call it Lutheranism. Why? Because Martin Luther is the instigator. He was a German monk who writes this. It doesn't write it. He lists his criticisms of the Catholic Church. It was called the 95 Thesis, and he nails it to the church wall of a church, a Catholic church in Germany, in Wittenberg. He is excommunicated for these criticisms in 1521, but a lot of local political leaders actually side with Luther, probably because they resented the power of the Catholic Church and how the Catholic Church was trying to influence them politically. So supporters of Luther were Lutherans or Protestants, kind of the same thing, so don't get confused. And it's interesting during this time. On one hand, the Catholic Church actually helped promote women's rights to an extent because you did have leaders in the Catholic Church who were women, nuns. Um, Women took administrative positions. Actually, during the Reformation, Martin Luther himself was very critical of women's rights. So he wasn't a promoter of that per se, but um, women were relied on by by Lutherans to teach children the Bible. So in a way, women were kind of gaining some importance, but yet they weren't seen in an equal light as well. It was weird. If you're comparing how women, I think women probably had a better deal under the Catholic Church, but at the same time, they did find some benefits, or they were kind of still important to an extent. All right, so this 95 thesis, it's simple. It's kind of like a declaration of independence in a sense, right? And the biggest criticism that Martin Luther had was that the church would sell indulgences, and it's very simple. If you gave the Catholic Church some money, they would free you from sin, right? Kind of a racket if you think about it, right? Very simple. So if you pay the church, the priest would cancel punishment for sin, and now you're going to get to heaven. He was also concerned about the luxurious life that church leaders were living, and also some other corrupt practices. He just believed in a simple process, rejecting materialism, rejecting corruption. He was very true to those beliefs, and he didn't like the fact that the Catholic Church was maybe even becoming too political, right? So that's basically what he nailed on that church, those criticisms. As a whole, Martin Luther believed that if you want to achieve salvation, you didn't need to listen to a priest. You still had to go to church to learn, but if you really want a true salvation, you follow what's in the Bible. And that's why, he believed that all people should be able to read this Bible. And it was important for this Bible to be in local language. Again, the source of religious authority to him was the Bible, not the Pope or the church leader. So basically what he's doing is he's challenging the influence of the Pope in a sense. And that created a massive rift. So nothing there you'd have to know, but just understand his basic belief system. You didn't need the priest or the Pope to get to heaven. Protestantism is spread mainly because of this printing press right here. I would remember this. Johann Gutenberg was a German inventor. Remember, he doesn't invent the printing press. The Chinese do. He just kind of makes it more, advanced. He uses a lot of movable block type, but it's more advanced than what the Chinese had. But you give them, credit for influencing them. So, what's going to be the first thing printed? The Bible, actually. And it's going to be translated into different languages, those vernacular languages. And that's going to basically, not only the Bible, but a lot of Luther's beliefs and ideas in the form of a pamphlet are going to be spread. So it's like, it spreads like wildfire. And because of that, we start to see the establishment of Luther churches or Protestant churches. And basically there would be different churches, so you'll have Lutheranism, Calvinism, Anglicanism, Quakers, Puritan, Anabaptists. So they're Protestant sects of Lutheranism, but they all kind of believe in the same basic tenets of Martin Luther. So if you see if you drive around and you see a Lutheran church, it's Protestant. If you see a Baptist church, it's Protestant. A congregational church, it's probably going to be Protestant. I'm a congregationalist myself. Presbyterian, for example. Those are all Protestant churches that, again, are under the umbrella of Martin Luther and Lutheranism. And that's important. You're going to see, you're going to have Catholic churches and you're going to have Protestant churches. And they all believe that Jesus is the Savior, but they have different viewpoints on the role of the priest, for example. Also, Protestant churches or Protestantism doesn't believe in the sacraments per se. So they might believe in a baptism, but maybe they don't believe in, for example, confessing sin in order to get to heaven. So those Catholic practices were not, all of the Catholic practices weren't adopted by Protestant churches. All right, and Protestantism, because of the printing press, is going to spread like wildfire, right? So in the purple, you're going to see Catholic churches. In the orange, you're going to see those Protestant denominations, Lutheranism, Anglicanism, Anabaptism. The lighter yellow, it's probably going to be a combination of things, maybe more Catholic, but with some Protestant churches here and there, but mostly probably Catholic. In yellow, Poland was a Catholic location. And then remember, if you keep going into this part of the world right here, it's Orthodox Christianity. That hasn't changed. So if in Russia, in Eastern Europe, right along here where we can't see it, that's definitely Orthodox. Here you go, right here in the purple, Orthodox. Right. And remember the Holy Roman Empire, this is going to be mostly Catholic through here. But parts of the Holy Roman Empire are going to be Protestant as well. This is where Germany would be. Wittenberg is where he nailed down that thesis. All right, so Calvinism is a Protestant sect, or a result of Lutheranism, for example. So John Calvin, like Martin Luther, was believed in simple living, a simple church. He actually came up with this idea of predestination. He believed that actually God determined who was going to get to heaven and who was not. That was a little different than what Luther believed. So no one knew. So in order to get to heaven, you kind of had to be your best. You had to, follow the tenets of the Bible. But not everyone made it. Again, it was about predestination. And his followers in France were called Huguenots, and in England they were called Puritans. You've probably heard of Puritans. Pilgrims were not Puritans, but eventually they kind of merged into one sect in Massachusetts. The Puritans are going to establish basically Boston. If you take AP US, you'll have to know who the Puritans were. And this idea of a work ethic, a Protestant work ethic that was very important to the Puritan communities, is something that Calvin believed in, right? You got to work hard and you got to be a good Christian in order to get to heaven, just in case you're destined to get there. So again, not everyone was going to heaven. In his mind, you were predestined. But you still had to, again, be a good Protestant. The Anabaptists, you're going to see them in Northern Europe. They also believed in kind of a simplistic church. They were very wary of government. They denied the authority of local governments. They themselves would not go to war. They were pacifists. They wouldn't bear arms. They wouldn't swear loyalty oaths. They wouldn't even participate in government. They were big believers in secularism. They believed that the church and government should be completely separate, and they didn't want to get involved in government. They also lived separate from society because of that. They basically viewed, the typical European society as being very sinful. So they were unique. You might see the Anabaptists in a source. Again, they're just another sect of Protestantism. They did believe in the idea of baptizing adult members, not children. Once you're baptized, you are now basically, you have to do good things. They believed kids could sin, that was fine, but once you're baptized, now you have to be, pure. They are the ancestors to Quakers, who are going to colonize Pennsylvania, and Baptists, okay? Anglicanism, another sect of Protestantism. Anglicanism is basically, it's the Church of England, and Anglicanism emerges during the reign of King Henry VIII. Now, he's famous for having all these wives. He actually has a bunch of wives executed for various reasons, but his first kind of controversy is when he basically breaks from the Catholic Church because the Pope won't give him a divorce. He wants a divorce from Catherine of Aragon. Where is she? Over here, because she can't give him a child. There is this belief that, during the Age of Discovery, you're going to have a lot of STDs coming back to Europe. It's possible that, that contributed to some of these kings having problems having children. But anyway, he couldn't have a child. He blamed Catherine. He wanted to marry a younger woman, and the Pope said, no, you can't do that. The Catholic Church doesn't believe in divorce. So what does Henry do? He basically says, all right, I'll create my own church. And he literally creates his own church, the Anglican or Church of England. Anglican Church or the Church of England. And what he does is it's a church that combines Protestant doctrines and also Catholic practices. But the most important part is that the Pope had nothing to do with this church. It was completely separate from there was no influence, there was no, impact by the Pope. Anyone who went against him was usually killed. Anyone who supported the old religion was pretty much wiped out. He wasn't too great with the Anabaptists or those Puritans. So basically, it was his way or the highway. So again, he establishes the Church of England, or the Anglican Church. Mary, his daughter, takes over, and she actually tries to bring Catholicism back. She goes after Protestants. She burns many at the stake, and we name the Bloody Mary after her. Basically, it's tomato juice with something. I forget what it is in there. Some kind of alcohol. Maybe gin, vodka. I have no idea. But that's Mary. She is replaced by Elizabeth, her sister, who kind of goes back to the blending, right? The Anglican Church that combines Catholicism with Protestantism. Again, there are radical Protestants called the Puritans who just didn't like any Catholic elements. So they are tired of it. They want to purify the English Church, be more in line with Lutheranism, I guess you could say. Actually, they were followers of Calvinism. So they wanted to see that type of doctrine. So they take off and they move to Massachusetts. Those are the Puritans. The Pilgrims came earlier. They too, they wanted a complete separation with the Church of England. I forgot what, I don't know if they were Anabaptists, but the Puritans just want to purify the Church of England. The Pilgrims wanted a separation, and they come first to Plymouth, Massachusetts. And then the Puritans follow. Eventually, the Puritans and Pilgrims kind of become one, and it just becomes a Puritan colony. All right, so in response to Protestantism, the Catholic Church kind of gets its act together. Pope Paul III, to win back followers, he initiates a council, and this council, or Council of Trent, comes up with a plan. And basically, they reaffirm Catholic teachings, but most importantly, they put an end to church abuses. They eliminate the sale of indulgences, and they kind of limit certain church positions, and they put an emphasis on just a better educated clergy. So they clean house. Catholicism does not die out, and as you know today, if you go to Europe, especially Spain and Portugal, Catholicism is pretty strong. Ireland's interesting. In Ireland, it's a two-religion state. So part of Ireland, one half of Ireland is Protestant. The other half of Ireland is actually Catholic, and they've battled for many years. It's a lot calmer now, but for many years there was a lot of fighting. France, I think, too, has some Catholic elements, but they are also mostly Protestant, I believe. So, Catholicism does not die out. So please remember this response, the Catholic counter, or just the counter-reformation. All right, so during this time, there's a lot of religious conflict between Protestants and Catholics. So one of the first conflicts is in 1554 between the Holy Roman Emperor Charles and German Lutherans. So, Germany is part of the Holy Roman Empire. It's a state, not a kingdom, but it's a state in this empire. The Lutherans and the Catholics battle it out. In the end, there's this Peace of Augsburg, and at the end, it's interesting. German states could decide what they want to do. So if you look at that map, if we were to go back, you'll see in the Holy Roman Empire there's a fragmentation. There's a little bit of Catholicism, there's some Lutheranism. So that's kind of what happens. 1562 to 1598, there are a series of violent conflicts in France between Catholics and Protestants. The Huguenots are under attack because they're the Protestants. Remember, they're followers of Calvinism. They are the minority. For example, in one day, about 3,000 of them were massacred by Catholic mobs. So it was very violent. Here's a picture of it. This is settled by King Henry IV of France. Don't get confused with the Henrys. The names kind of are bouncing back and forth between one country and another. Not the same people. Maybe the same family lineage. Sometimes kings would kind of, marry their sons and daughters off to another country. So anyway, the Edict of Nantes, simple. It actually, like the Peace of Augsburg, it kind of just established, peace, right? So it's going to establish religious toleration to French Protestants in France. And the idea, though, is that the king believed eventually they would just become Catholic again, which isn't true because if you go to France today, it's a very Protestant nation as well. That's the Edict of Nantes. The 30 Years' War took place in the Holy Roman Empire later on, right? Even though there was that peace treaty, 1618 to 1648. About 100 years later. It begins in the Holy Roman Empire, but it envelops most of Europe. And it's very destructive all over Europe, mostly because soldiers of the empire kind of went in and pretty much, initiated atrocities in civilian communities. About 30% of the German population died from violence and famine. So again, it's this theme of conflict over religion. 1648, there is a peace treaty, the Peace of Westphalia. Like the Augsburg Peace, it established the fact that, hey, these states could control their own religious affairs. So Scotland, Norway, and Sweden would be Protestant. France, Spain, Ireland, and Italy would be mostly Catholic. Anglican would have the state church or the Anglican Church. In the Holy Roman Empire, it actually gave more autonomy to states like Austria, Germany, and Prussia, and eventually those states would establish their own kingdoms, right? Or large nations. Eventually the Holy Roman Empire dies out, and you're going to have these states emerge as nations eventually. Prussia becomes part of Germany, so that kind of consolidates eventually. All right, and so that's kind of the map in 1648. Right here's the Holy Roman Empire. Prussia's over here. Germany's over here. You've got the Netherlands. That's a state. Bavaria, I believe, is Switzerland. That would become, obviously, a larger country down the road. Austria, or Bohemia, is a state. So again, this is this Holy Roman Empire. And again, it's going to be broken up into different religions, right? So Catholicism and Protestantism are going to kind of be connected. All right, Christianity will spread. Obviously, the Puritans are bringing it to the Americas. Explorers, traders, they're all going to bring their faith with them. Why did explorers explore? Obviously for gold and silver, find spices in Asia, but also to spread God, right? Spread Christianity. And that's important. That's an important concept. Catholic missionaries were considered to be the most successful, though, especially in South America, Central America, California, Texas, Mexico. Orders are, it's just kind of missionary groups. So if you see a Dominican or a Franciscan or a Jesuit, these are different orders of monks, right? They're all Catholic. I'm not sure exactly, why they're different, but if you see those terminologies, you're thinking Catholicism. Portuguese missionaries spread Christianity or Catholicism to Africa and Asia, especially India. French missionaries are going to travel to, Canada and what would be Michigan and Ohio and Indiana today. Russian missionaries are going to spread Orthodox Christianity throughout that region. And but overall, you're not going to see a lot of Christianity in Asia. There's going to be some diasporic communities, but mostly, Christianity is going to spread to, west into the Americas. A little progress, but not as much as you're going to see in the Americas. The Spanish were most successful. How? Military conquest. They literally forced, American Indians to convert. The settlements or the colonies were very large. Lots of Spanish peninsulares, they're called. People born in Spain are going to pour into the Americas with their families. So in a way, American Indian communities are going to be overrun just by a lot of Spanish people. The missionary activity was intense. Lots of priests, lots of these orders are going to establish missions in like San Diego or San Francisco where they can get out and do their work. They forced American Indians into labor, so a lot of disease would wipe out American Indian leadership. So American Indians kind of gave up and just accepted these changes. Also, American Indians didn't have that literate world religion or that polytheistic religion. They were spiritual, they were polytheistic, but I guess they were easily kind of converted in a sense to Christianity because of Christianity's, simplicity, right? The idea of a heaven. All right, so almost done. So some of the modern states, as I mentioned, are emerging. Remember, this is a huge political change by the 1400s. Feudalism is in the decline because of the plague and peasant revolts, right? There weren't a lot of workers because they died, so those who survived could basically ask for, pay. They forced the noble's hand in a sense. Monarchies are going to emerge. King Henry was part of a monarchy or a ruling family, kind of like a dynasty, the Tudor family. They're going to centralize power by taxing, by having a state religion, for example, right? Definitely not, secular, that's for sure. At least the Anglican Church wasn't secular. Isabella and Ferdinand would be the famous king and queen of Spain who promote Columbus's journey. A new middle class is going to emerge. It's very powerful. They're going to kind of, compete a little bit with monarchs, right, for wealth. Merchants and traders and bankers are going to make a lot of money in the Americas, and that's going to, kind of make these kings a little concerned and jealous, right? James the First, you don't have to remember his name, but just understand what's happening is that he tries to consolidate or strengthen his power by an act called the True Law of Free Monarchy, which basically said he can make the laws, right? So that consolidates power quite a bit. Even though laws unify, he is making up those laws. But we've seen that, right, with Hammurabi's Code or, the Justinian Code. Not the first time a ruler establishes law. And finally, the idea of divine right. Very similar to the mandate of heaven. These monarchs believed that God chose them to lead, and that was used to justify their rule. So very important concept right there. Very similar to, I think what Constantine believed in, obviously the mandate of heaven going back to the Chinese dynasty. So there's a continuum there in terms of how these rulers justified their power and their rule. All right, so something that's important is that during this time, though, monarchs didn't rule absolutely, in a sense. There was kind of some pushback. So in 1642, the English actually had their own civil war, almost like their own little revolution. Not like the American Revolution or the French Revolution, but still there was pushback. So in England, you had two groups. You had the Stuarts, who would be that ruling family or one of the ruling families, and Parliament. Parliament is the governing body. I think I mentioned this in Unit 3. England did have kind of a small checks and balance system or some separation of powers. They had a Congress, right? The poor people weren't represented, but landowners were, for example. So Parliament did try to check the power of the king. At that time, many Puritans had kind of emerged, and they were kind of, the Puritan groups were in charge of Parliament. In 1215, 400 years earlier, we do have this Magna Carta. It is kind of strengthened later on by the Petition of Right in 1628. And all that means is what both of these documents did. What the Petition of Right did is it strengthened the rights that were established in the Magna Carta that would check. Remember, the Magna Carta was used to check, William, right, the early Norman ruler. But basically, it said that the king could not levy taxes without Parliament's consent. And other certain things like trial by jury. And that's important. That's the foundation of our, Bill of Rights, our Constitution. Charles I actually ignores Parliament, and he is overthrown, heads cut off by Parliament. And that leader at the time was a man named Oliver Cromwell. I think this is him right here. So there's a little civil war between Charles and Parliament, and Charles loses. And again, it's over this ability to check, right? Check the power of the king. The Glorious Revolution, 1685, kind of a similar fight. James II is replaced by Protestants, a Protestant king and queen named William and Mary. There's a college in Virginia named after them. And the reason that he was replaced was because people in England feared he would spread Catholicism and also break from Parliament, kind of disregard the Petition of Right and the Magna Carta. And it's under William and Mary that an English Bill of Rights is established. Very important. And it just basically protects the civil liberties of the people of England. It also establishes a Toleration Act, which gave freedom to non-Anglicans. And it actually also said that the king had to be Anglican, again, because at this time there was this fear that Catholicism would come and kind of reestablish itself. So, you have the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution. Again, what do they have in common? They both were, were pushback to kings who were trying to take away power from the people, or at least the landowners, right? The aristocratic class. All right, again, almost done. So it's during this time that the idea of a social contract theory emerges, and it's pretty interesting. And it's really simple. It's this idea that there is a contract between the people and the rulership. And Thomas Hobbes had a different take on it. He wrote a book called The Leviathan. This is a famous cartoon about his book. And it basically, he believed the contract was simple, that in return for security and prosperity that the king would give the people would then give up certain liberties. It kind of promoted the idea of an all-powerful monarch. Not really Machiavellian, but it's this idea that an authoritarian ruler was good. A single ruler who wasn't checked could be more effective. And because of that, he could provide for security and prosperity. I think Trump would kind of support that idea probably today, right? He probably gets annoyed that Congress checks him all the time. And so if you see this cartoon, that's kind of a cartoon that was used to kind of summarize the ideas of Hobbes. John Locke took it a little differently. He believed the contract theory was this contract where actually the government was in a contract with the people, and the government was to protect those rights. It was up to the government to not only provide security and prosperity, but to protect the human or natural rights of people. And if the king didn't afford the people those rights or didn't protect those rights, the people had a right to rebel. And it's John Locke who comes up with the idea of all men are basically given the rights of life, liberty, and property. And if that sounds familiar, well, Thomas Jefferson kind of borrowed those ideas. He just changed it to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in the Declaration of Independence. So his book is The Two Treaties of Government. You want to remember that. And again, he is basically explaining his version of this social contract theory. And this is important. John Locke is, again, kind of bringing attention to the power of the king, and he's questioning that divine right in a sense, right? And he doesn't believe that the king has ultimate power, that at the end of the day, the king has to protect the rights that God affords the people. All right, so let's quickly just kind of talk about what's happening in France during this time. I'm sorry I didn't put a date. I should have. I think I started to, but it's sometime in the 1400s. Louis the 14th, also known as the Sun King. He too promoted the idea of divine right. He too centralized government with intendants or tax collectors. He established actually a policy of a tax-free area. So if you lived in this five great farm area, you didn't have to pay taxes. And the idea was that the people in that area would produce and manufacture goods. Think about Jersey City, where the sales tax is a lot cheaper in Jersey City than it is where I live. And that's to get people to buy and make things, right? So again, it's just an example of the government regulating the economy. He has a very famous palace. I'll show you some pictures. It's a symbol of this absolute power. It was kind of, it was a monstrosity. It was expensive. It was kind of ridiculous. He expanded borders through war and diplomacy, but unfortunately, this is going to result in financial problems, and that's going to down the road lead to a major revolution called the French Revolution. So if you're writing an essay about the French Revolution, Louis XIV would be great context for that revolution. We don't have the revolution if Louis XIV doesn't waste a lot of that money on his palace. He refused to share power with nobles, and that's, again, going to weaken France and lead to revolution because the nobles are going to be the ones that are going to fight back. And that's his palace. Still used today in France, not as a palace, but more as a museum and a place where you might have, a lot of peace treaties might be signed there, for example. And here it is. Pretty amazing place. I'd love to go someday. But very expensive, and a lot of the people in France were pretty poor and starving during this time. So I think there was a lot of building resentment. All right, almost done. 2 more slides, I promise. Scientific revolution. So it's also during this time that we have some the Protestant Reformation. People are thinking, people are challenging the church. Well, so do scientists and scholars. They start to question traditional viewpoints about religion. They're inspired by the Renaissance. They're inspired by Martin Luther King. So it's during this time we have a surge in scientific thinking. And scientists are going to basically say, let's start to use logic and reasoning to answer questions about the universe. The church was not using logic and data and reasoning. Their theories were very off, to put it mildly. Francis Bacon is the father of the scientific method. That is also known as empiricism, or using data to back up a hypothesis. The church didn't use data to back up a hypothesis about, the church believed that Earth was the center of the universe. And that's going to be challenged by Copernicus and Galileo. A lot of these ideas are going to spread through correspondence. You're going to have academies where essays are going to be written. Those essays are going to be printed and spread, and these ideas are going to grow like wildfire. Copernicus was a scientist who questioned the Earth-centered theory. His theory was known as the heliocentric theory. It's interesting that Copernicus was so afraid of how the church would punish him that he didn't even have his findings published until after his death. Galileo would confirm this theory using the telescope, so they're kind of united together. Isaac Newton would also base a lot of his data on the works of Galileo and Copernicus, and he would establish the law of gravity. So what's happening? It's this idea now that the world was actually ordered and rational, and there was science that could explain what's happening around the world. And they're using natural laws, and this idea of natural law or nature or using logic and reasoning would then be applied to government and society. Questioning the idea of divine right, for example, that's not logic or reasonable. That a king is tied into God. So the scientific revolution is going to provide the foundation for the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment, again, is emerging during this time. John Locke was the one we mentioned earlier. It's basically it's a thinking or a thought revolution. So we talked about scholasticism during the earlier Middle Age lesson, and that was interesting because people were beginning to wonder perhaps if we should think more logically, but it combined faith and reason. So. And the Enlightenment did not do that. It completely eliminated the idea of spirituality and faith in explaining natural laws and natural things. The Enlightenment focused on applying reason to discover natural laws in order to make progress politically and socially. And what does that mean? It means, again, let's question monarchies, and let's question divine right, and let's question, old political systems and political beliefs. Let's question old ways of learning, for example, old ideas about rights and freedoms. And these men and women are all philosophers, philosophes. Their writings were in things called encyclopedias. Yes, the encyclopedia. So John Locke was the father of natural rights and rebellion. Voltaire was a French philosopher who advocated for more free speech, religious toleration, and his ideas were very important to the U.S. Bill of Rights. Baron de Montesquieu, a Frenchman, pushed for the separation of powers and a checks and balance system, which obviously we have borrowed. And then there's Jean-Jacques Rousseau. I think he was French too, I forget. But he argued for representative governments, and he believed that the government had to, they were at the will of the people, right? Very John Lockean in a sense. Definitely rejecting a guy like Thomas Hobbes. So you definitely want to be familiar with these four. Probably the most interesting is Mary Wollstonecraft, the woman. There was a female philosopher, so add her to the list of great women in history. She wrote a book called The Vindication of the Rights of Women, and she pushed for access to education, full citizenship, and financial autonomy. These ideas had the greatest impact on the middle class. I'm sorry, it wasn't the noble class that I mentioned earlier. The leaders of the French Revolution were the merchants, the bankers, the lawyers, maybe the smaller landowners, but they were educated, and they're going to read the ideas of Voltaire and Montesquieu, and they're going to lead the peasants in a revolution against the king and the noble class. But we'll get to that down the road. All right, guys? Thanks. So we're going to do another lecture on mercantilism later, so I'm going to shut it down for now. Thanks.